Okay, yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us today. So the first talk of the semester, so in the second of the season this year. And so I am Jean-Gabriel Young, for those who don't know me, an assistant professor at the Center of Complex Systems at the University of Vermont. And this seminar series is co-organized by Juniper Lovato, who is here, Alice Petania, a professor at the center, and Melissa Rubinchuk and Nicholas Roberts. And so together, we're putting out this amazing season. And so we have today Dr. Crabtree, and also coming up several good talks. The next talk in the series is going to be by Albert Kao and Hiroki Sayama. And then we have 5 more talks. I encourage you to check the information about this series on our website, vermontcomplexsystems.org, or on Twitter at UVM and so before we start, just to remind everyone a little bit of a few ground rules. So as you heard, the talk will be recorded and posted online. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please turn off your camera. You can interact via the chat, and we will just repeat your questions and so on. And so you can do this privately. Also, if you have any questions during the talk, we would ask you, unless the speaker asks otherwise, to keep them until the end. If you have pressing, clarifying question, type them in the chat and we can intervene kind of at appropriate times. And then as a last, an important reminder, the talk series is meant to be a fun and inclusive space. So please be respectful of others and the speaker when you intervene. And so with this now, moving on to today's talk, I'm just going to say a few words briefly about the speaker. So Dr. Stefani is an assistant professor in socio-environmental modeling in the Department of Environment and Society at Utah State University, also affiliated with SFI, the Santa Fe Institute, Biosocial Complex Systems Fellow. She holds many other appointments, including the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, the Center for Research and Interdisciplinarity, and the Australian Research Council Center and Excellence of Australian Biodiversity and Heritage. Our research spans complex systems, science modeling, ecology, and social sciences. She has 2 PhDs, something I learned today, one from the University of Washington and one from the Université de Franche-Comté. And she can hold a very good conversation in French. And so with that, I will leave you the metaphorical floor. And thank you again for being here.
Mais j'espère que vous ne voudriez pas que je fais ma colloque en français aujourd'hui. J'ai pas pratiqué. Thank you very much for that fantastic introduction. I'm very excited to be giving this talk. My paternal grandmother is actually from Burlington, Vermont, and I have never visited. And so this is my first digital visit to Burlington, and I can't wait to be able to come visit in person and see some areas that hold important familial stigmergic effects for me. So today I'm going to be talking about Australia, and I'll be talking mostly about one bit of research that I have, but I need to ask something of you as my audience. This is the first time I've been allowed to talk about a portion of this research that will show up at the very end, and it's still somewhat classified. So I have to ask, will everyone please promise that they will not tweet when I show not tweet and not put this anywhere online? I know I already spoke with Jean-Gabriel. I have it very well demarcated as to which bits are not allowed, but just I want to make sure that we have, it's like the verbal confirmation on an airplane that you will assist people when you leave. I have verbal confirmation that you are not going to talk about this, right? I'm getting some thumbs up. Okay, great. Let's go on a trip to Australia. So just in 2 seconds, I'm going to talk about kind of what brought me to working in Australia, which is modeling the human ecosystem connection within here. This is all in my 2019 paper that looks at food webs within Australia and looks at placing the Mardu Aboriginal people within these food webs. So this is the highest resolved human-centered food web that's ever been published. And if you haven't seen a food web, they look kind of like this. I'm showing you The little white dots are mardu. This is all the stuff that they eat. And I'm really just showing you this as this is why I went there. I'm an archaeologist and anthropologist who also studies ecology, and I wanted to understand how mardu were critical in the ecosystem. So I looked at what it was like until 1964 when they were nomadic foragers on the landscape. These are all the things that they ate. And then I looked at what they do today, and flour and ham represents their store-bought foods. And so that paper really dives into that. This is all I'm saying about it. That's just to give you an idea. If you want me to give another talk, I can talk about human and ecology and how people are embedded within ecosystems and why that matters for sustainability. But that's not actually what we're talking about today. We're going to be modeling the deep past. So looking at things that are 70,000 years old as a way for understanding our present and future challenges as a people. So humans are everywhere, and we have gotten there on our own 2 feet. We have walked from the Horn of Africa across Europe and Asia into Australia, and of course into the Americas as well. Because of this, we can kind of understand that people may have some fundamental rules that influence our decisions on how and where we migrate. As I said, people get there by walking on their own 2 feet, and that causes interesting challenges. If we think about the ways that people migrated 200,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, our brains were basically the same. So the decisions that we were making are going to be similar decisions to what we are making today if we were to migrate on our own 2 feet as well. As people move into new landscapes, they encounter new different things, and they will experience the world at a slower pace than the way that we experience the world today in cars and airplanes. But we can still experience these kinds of feelings when we are migrating into new areas and we are experiencing new areas. And so I want you, as a person living in the 21st century, to realize that your brains are very similar to the brains of people who lived 65, 70,000 years ago. And the decisions that they made about how to migrate would be very similar to decisions that you make today, because our cognitive capacity has basically remained unchanged-ish for that amount of time. So we're going down into Sahul, but during the time that I'm looking at, which is about 70,000 years ago, the world looked very different. There was a lot of global water that was stuck up in sea ice. And so very shallow continental shelves were exposed. That meant that there were places like New Guinea and Australia that were joined together, and Tasmania is also joined together as well, that formed these larger supercontinents. This supercontinent was known as Sahul, so I'll be referring to it as Sahul as I talk about it. Now, we know that people got there when British explorers arrived in Australia in the 1700s. They encountered rich Aboriginal cultures, millions of people living on this landscape. And so we knew that people had been there for a while. The question was, how did it happen? Now, this isn't a new question. In the 1950s, Birdsell suggested a scatter process. Bowdler came in the 70s and said that people hugged the coasts. Other people suggested following along the woodlands, and there is even a board game that you can buy about the peopling of Australia, Sunda to Sahul. We're pretty sure that people showed up in boats, and then they quickly abandoned boat technology once they arrived there. And then the questions of how they moved throughout the continent was still an open question until we started looking at this question ourselves. So this is just to give you an idea of these conceptual models. We have kind of that Benny Hill model where people arrive and just run around in A. We have people scattering around, hugging the coasts. We have people grabbing those forests. These are all verbal models. They're conceptual models. These are not computationally assessed because it's pretty expensive to understand something at a continental scale. And so until recently, this has been essentially where the science was. We have genetic evidence as well, sparse genetic evidence, But the work I'm presenting to you today is the first effort to really understand how the peopling could have happened. So let's go back to ethnography and the summer of 2017. Remember, I mentioned that paper that I had come out in 2019, and really the reason for that paper was going down to the Western Desert to do ethnographic work. So I was there trying to understand how people were embedded in the ecosystems. And one of the things that people do is that in Australian winter, they light fires. These are very small fires of about 1 to 5 hectare. And these fires, what they do is it exposes the burrows of small animals that they can hunt. And with these fires, what this ends up doing is over time, it creates a patchy mosaic. So you'll have one area that's been burnt in the last day or so. You'll have other areas that have been burnt in the last year. And the plants grow back in about a 7-year cycle. And so the 7-year cycle means that there's this patchy landscape of small shrubs, big floofy spinifex that needs to be burned. And here you can see Nyalanka walking around and lighting the fire. They have this depth of knowledge for understanding how the wind is going so that they don't create an out of scale fire. While I was out there doing this work to understand the human place in the ecosystem and what people do in this long-term coevolution with the ecosystem, something else that I was experiencing was walking around the desert with Mardu people quite a lot. And at one point I was doing a plant survey and people I was with said that they were going to go on a different direction. And I said I would catch up with them. And I realized I was so involved in my work that when I looked up, I had absolutely no idea where they went. And the initial form of panic of being a lost girl in the desert faded quickly when I realized that if I just used my head and listened to hear where people were, I would be able to figure out where my party had gone to. And so it was not a huge traumatic experience, but it felt for those 10 seconds like a lost child in the supermarket, if you know what I mean. But that experience made me very interested in the ways that people were wayfinding when we were in landscapes that we were not familiar with. And so another thing about Mardu is that they lived until 1964, traditional lifeways, and between the 60s and the 80s, they were removed to the cattle stations on the periphery. And so people have returned back to this land and are reacquainting themselves with the land. And so a lot of this wayfinding, these skills that I've asked about are things from both pre-1964 and new. So asking them about rules for how they would wander around, I came up with 4 different rules that they had. People look to horizons for orienting. So if you have ever been in an area that you're unfamiliar with, whether it is a open landscape or in a city, a lot of the time, if you come out of the subway in New York and you've never been to New York and you know you need to go somewhere, you could look up and say, that's the Chrysler building, so I know which way I am facing, and I'm gonna go this direction. People do this as well in the Western Desert. People try to camp at water nightly. People carry around 10 kilos of water on forays, and women lead the pack. So for horizons, if you're wandering in a new area, you may orient yourself by high places. That may mean that you start walking toward a high place on the horizon, and then at some point, you know you're going to want to take a left. And so you use these horizon markers as ways to give yourself a mental map. And these were things that all of the elders I asked said that they do. As a Westerner from the desert, but not the Australian desert, I definitely came to the Western Desert of Australia with this idea that water would be a limiting factor. But when I talked to Mardu women, they said, no, water is not the limiting factor. The limiting factor is food. As children, they are taught where all of the water sources are and the hierarchy of those water sources. And what I mean by that is there will be rock holes, which are little seep water pools that they know will exist year round. There are water holes that are going to be seasonal, and so they'll use those first. There are going to be arroyos that flood with water from occasion. And so they have all of this in a mental map that's a part of their religious practice called the dream time. And so they camp at water nightly. They walk between places, knowing where their endpoints are. When I was preparing for this presentation, I was interested to learn that other places camp at water nightly. And recently, Saudi Arabia, to help people who are wandering through the desert not die of thirst when they get lost, have placed 11 solar energy powered laser lights near water sources in the Al Juf region of the desert to help people who may get lost to be able to make it to water at night so they can refresh themselves. And so these rules that I'm coming up with for people 70,000 years ago, think about these as things you could still use today. I asked about how much water people would carry, because even if you're going to camp at water nightly, you still have to carry water with you. And people carried quite a lot. 10 kilos is quite a lot of water. But you have to be able to bring that with you in case of water stress. And I was told one story of travelers traveling at night and using the sand to bury themselves during the day because it was so hot and they didn't have quite enough water to minimize body stress. But these are all rules that they have built into their Dreamtime or Jakurpa stories. And then women lead the pack. So if you think about it, we would have multi-generational groups walking through the desert, walking through Australia, walking through Sahul. And for Mardu Aboriginal people, when they would walk on long forays, the women would keep the group together. They would carry children. Men would sometimes wander off to hunt a bustard or a kangaroo and then come back. But the women were keeping the elderly, the children, everyone together to make sure everyone was there. And so this is critical as we get to the model. All right, so wrapping up the ethnography, we're then going to move on to the model. Now, this is not my model. This is a model by Timmerman and Friedrich that looks at carrying capacity of areas with population and sea ice. But I thought it was a good visualization of how you can use computational models over time to show you how things happen, okay? So what I wanted to do was model the deep past. How did Australian Aboriginal people get into and spread through Sahul 70,000 years ago? It's a simple question, but it's a very computationally complex problem. Now, path models have been used elsewhere. If you have a GIS program, there is a least cost path algorithm. Generally speaking, what it uses is Tobler's hiking function, which is what tells you how calorically expensive it's going to be for you to walk, or how difficult it's going to be for you to walk in an area. If you buy a guidebook at REI, if people are like me and they still buy physical guidebooks, when there's those rankings that say very hard, easy, that's what they're telling you. Is it flat? Is it slopey? It's from this Tobler's hiking function. And so that goes within your GIS. Here I'm showing you an example of a published path model that was by Michael Fraschetti that looked at essentially from point A to point B, where would people go? They're usually pretty simple. You're looking at, here's your origin, here's your destination point. But to be able to look at this at a continental scale requires something else. So Devin White, who is an old friend and colleague of mine, got his PhD in archaeology from CU Boulder and now is the director of autonomous sensing at Sandia National Labs. For his PhD, he developed this workflow called From Everywhere to Everywhere. So instead of having input destination points, we're trying to look at where everybody could go. He originally used this within Oaxaca, which you can see here, to look at trade routes. And so we started talking about, could we take his From Everywhere to Everywhere as the beginning scaffolding? And then can we build on it to look at the connections throughout an entire continent that's relatively flat and see something about how people would move? And so what we created was the largest path modeling project ever attempted. So if you like math, look to the left, and if you don't, you can look to the people walking in White Sands National Monument on the right. So we ended up building in Tobler's hiking function, of course, because it is kind of the backbone for a lot of things. And I should say that if you ever want to do models of human anything, start looking at the US military. There are tons of white papers where they want to look at the exact evapotranspiration of a soldier as he walks through the 97-degree heat while carrying 25 kilos. Gives you a whole lot of data. So what we started with was we have Tobler's hiking function. So how fast can you walk on a slope? We then look at Handal's function, which is an equation for looking at going uphill. And then we look at Santee's function for an equation for looking at going downhill. So even though downhill is easier, it still puts wear and tear on your body. And so we need to be able to take into account all of these. We look at how difficult this hiking could be. So are you walking through sand? Are you walking on hard ground? What are you walking on? These all take into account something. And then we have to look at that kilocalorie expenditure. So remember, I said that women are holding the pack together. So if we're modeling an average traveler coming into Sahul, we chose to model a 25-year-old woman. She'd be in the middle years of her fertility. She would have a certain height, certain weight. She would have different requirements for carrying things, a different evapotranspiration probabilities. And so there would be different constraints for men versus children, but you have to choose your average traveler. So our average traveler is a 25-year-old woman. So what this would look like, and this is a dummy model, is we bring in a topographic map, and then we give it input, embarkation, and destination points. So in a GIS map, you have pixels. And so you can have every single pixel be an input and destination point. But here we can see there are 25 input and destination points, just for simplicity. And then we use all of these bits together to calculate all of the paths. So what is the cost to go between this cell and this cell, or this cell and this cell? And then we get hundreds or thousands of these coming out. And then every time a path is chosen by a traveler, we essentially have like a counter, like going into a baseball game where you have the person sitting there with the little ticker. And every time something is chosen, that's a more frequently chosen path. And then we can choose the most highly chosen or the top 10% most highly chosen paths, et cetera. And that's what you see on the right. So this is the basis of our model to give you that simplification of how we did this. So the backbone of our model, I'll then walk through what that is like for all of Sahul. And we have some other things beyond just the caloric expenditure for an individual. So first is that we needed new data layers. There were no digital elevation models for Sahul. There are for Australia, New Guinea, Tasmania, and then there's some very fantastic floor bed scanning because of protections of the coral reefs. And so essentially what we did is we drained the oceans to what it would look like at about 70,000 years ago, and we stitched together a fine resolution digital elevation model for Sahul. This is the first time that this has ever been done. This is open access. People have already downloaded this thousands of times. So already this part of our work is impactful. So remember I said people had to look at the high points on the landscape. So we have to have a way of doing visual prominence. So what we did is we have a kind of moving window across all of Sahul, where we at one point we say, okay, from this point, what do you see? Or at this point, what do you see looking down? And so what this does is it creates a visual prominence layer for the entire continent. And this is, again, a first. It is also the largest visual prominence layer ever done. And I should mention that these digital elevation models are at 30 meters, which is pretty fine resolution. We can get some of it down lower, but you have to essentially coarse grain everything up to the worst resolution that you have. So everything's at 30 meters. So then we need to look at the rivers and arroyos. So we do know, right, the Colorado River, for example, has been there for a long time. We know this because the Grand Canyon is there. There are rivers in Australia that have been there for a long time, and arroyos that are very incised. And so what we did is we looked at these very old ones, and we did probability weighted river modeling all the way out to the coast of Sahul. and created this model of rivers and arroyos going all the way back, okay? So all of these then come together to be our digital elevation model. These then can have different weights. So in an original, if you were using an ArcGIS least cost path model, you just have a landscape with topography and you'd have people run around. But here what we have done is we have changed the from everywhere to everywhere approach to be able to incorporate any number of weighting layers. And then we can see different amounts of weighting. So is it 20% important to have high elevation? Does it change as you move throughout the lands? And so all of these layers, we could add anything else in it. Layers we didn't add were vegetation cover because, and I can talk about that more if you want later on, but essentially between 70,000 years and now, the vegetation cover is a little squidgy, and also the way that modern people move through the landscape, vegetation cover only changes their movement by about 50 to 100 meters. But we plan to incorporate that in future things. But anyways, this is just to tell you that we have all of these layers that we can now add things on top of. So then we run a combination of variables and weightings and we get paths out and we want to see which ones make sense. So I know you're not supposed to put a table in a talk, but I can't think of any other way to put this in here to tell you what we did. And so we have a grid across the landscape that says move from this point to this point, go from, try and explore the whole landscape. We have people arriving at a coastline and try to go anywhere on the continent. We have coastline trying to get to water sources. We have water to grid, water to water. And then we looked at these with and without the other weighting layers of visual prominence, etc. And so what this kind of looks like, this is not actually this model, this is using our model with an agent-based model. We can look at putting people in the landscape and seeing how they spread throughout the landscape. But this essentially gives you that idea of people showing up in one of the probable landing points in the northwest corner and then spreading throughout the whole continent. Okay. So Jean-Gabriel mentioned that I have a PhD in archaeology, and I haven't really spoken about archaeology once for this entire talk. And that's because I'm also a modeler. And to be a good modeler, you have to understand parsimony. You don't want to bake too much into your models, or else it'll tell you nothing. And so these models that we built were based on human caloric constraints, digital elevation models, and other kinds of things that we can model based on human decision making. Once we modeled these, we then brought in the archaeological record. So we compiled the first database of 30,000 years old and older archaeological sites for all of Salhoul, for New Guinea, Tasmania, and Australia. And so then what we want to look at is, are these old archaeological sites near or far from the most probably chosen paths? And so to be able to do that, we had to come up with some new statistics. So in statistics, a lot of the time when I took spatial statistics, I learned how to look at whether or not some points were completely spatially random or whether they were clustered or whatever. So a lot of the time what you're doing is you're inputting points, say trees where spotted owls are, and then you're randomizing them and looking at, you're kind of bootstrapping that process and looking at, okay, are these clustered? Are these dispersed? Are these random? But when you're comparing dots, archaeological sites, to networks, the paths, that's something I'd never done before. And so Devin, myself, and Corey, one of the co-authors, we sat down and we kind of invented some new statistics, which is a modification of Ripley's L test to treat the network as a single vector, to be able to look at the complete spatial random process of archaeological data against the network. And so once all of this comes together, we get this beautiful picture. So what this is showing you is from the 125 billion pathways that we modeled, this is giving you the top 1 and top 5% chosen pathways. So the top 1% are the red and the top 5% are kind of the yellow. And I mean, there are billions beyond that. But those black dots, those are the archaeological sites. And those we could then look at the weighting of different pathways. So what this tells us is that after generating 125 billion pathways, where people took into account nothing when they walked through the landscape, or they took into account walking with high points on the landscape, making sure that they could camp at water, looking at the caloric expenditures of women, that's when we got the most explanatory power from our models when we compared the network against the points. What this tells us is that our models give us an idea of how people could have tried to maximize water, do wayfinding with topography, and these corresponded best with the archaeological data. Those that did not take this into account had horrible explanatory power. So the null-null model of what does just the landscape tell us does not work. What works is when we take into account the human side of being human 70,000 years ago. Now, some sites in our pathways are not near what we're calling these superhighways, these pathways that were trod so many times. And what that ends up giving us is an idea of places to look. So there aren't that many old archaeological sites, partially because of depositional constraints, but partially because of where people have worked. And so these places where we have these highly trodden paths, there are archaeologists right now actually doing surveys down there and finding archaeological sites. And so one of the impacts of this work already is on trying to identify old archaeological sites in the arid interior. What I'm juxtaposing this map against here are trade routes in the 1800s, where we see explorers coming through, and we also have trade routes of things like native tobacco, greenstone. And one of the things we're interested in looking at is that stigmergic effect of pathways through time. So stigmergy is this idea that that landscapes have this thingness in our brains as people, and that they call to us over time and over time. I remember at the beginning I mentioned Aboriginal Dreamtime stories. So a lot of these stories link people who are thousands of miles apart. So one thing that we really want to do as we go forward is look at some of these Aboriginal stories and see how well they correspond to features on the landscape. They talk about tall features. They talk about things that link them. Are these, in fact, these networks that are linking people from all the way across Australia so that they could have these connections through story? So what our model tells us is that early people used a set of fundamental rules associated with physiological capacity, attraction to landscape features, and freshwater distribution to ensure success. People moved along a relatively small number of superhighways, and we should and are focusing prospection in these areas to understand more about our past. It might have implications for understanding megafauna. It looks like megafauna were obligate drinkers, and is the reason that megafauna went extinct so quickly after people arrived in Australia, a combination of the climatic disruption and people being brilliant and being able to go to these landscapes efficiently to be able to hunt them. What this modeling project hasn't told you about, it's kind of abstract. And so it doesn't tell you about the experience of migration. Migration is novel, it's exciting, it's challenging, it's scary, but you do what you can to make it feel easy. And so even as you come into these new landscapes that you've never seen before, you would have these rules in your heart that you hold on to, that you know where to find water, these things that can help you to make it, to constrain your variables, essentially. People would have come across megafauna that they'd never seen before. These things would have been exciting and scary and interesting. And I think that what's exciting about this work is the ability to humanize the past and be able to understand how people could be linked. We are working on this going forward, and we want to understand connectivity later in time, especially to understand these Dreamtime stories. And notice that I'm juxtaposing what I'm talking about against paintings by Mardu Aboriginal people. So this is a painting I bought for friends when they got married. It's by Helen Sampson. It's a painting of Puntawari. It's a representation of an area that's rich with water and stars. Mardu don't just paint, they paint landscapes, these bird's eye views of things. And so Helen Sampson's painting here is essentially a mental map of how to walk through an area that she remembers from childhood when she was 8 years old, migrating through this area with her grandparents. Here is a second painting that I bought for a different friend by Lavinia Biljabu. This is Nilankur on the canning stock route. On the left, you see an actual picture of the canning stock route taken from a drone. And on the right, you see her representation. I want to read this quote from the woman who I lived with when I was in the Western Desert, Nilanka Taylor. When Mardu paint, it's like a map. Mardu draws stories on the ground and on the canvas, and all the circle and line, there are the hunting areas and different waters and tracks that people used to walk. And some you can't cross, like boundaries. So nowadays you see a colorful painting and wonder what it is. But that's how Mardu tells story long ago. It's not just a lovely painting. It's a story and a songline and a history and everything that goes with it. And one final painting, which is by Mary Rowlands of Marble Bar. And the drone imagery is actually a drone imagery I took of Marble Bar. And so you can see these juxtaposed together where she is painting the spinifex growing up in these big hummocks and what that looks like to her and this kind of mental map painting. So this work shows you how people can move through areas on their own 2 feet, how we can constrain scary things, these variables, by making things easier for ourselves with these fundamental rules. And if any of this work sounded interesting to you, the paper was published in May. It is not open access because that was like $10,000, but it is open access if you email me. And I think you can find it on the internet. I think that what all of this work shows is this deep feedback between ecosystems and people, and the ways that we can use archaeological data to understand the fundamental ways that people exist and use the past as a way to model our present and our future. It is much less challenging to think about people 70,000 years ago than it is to think about climate refugees. But the ways that people moved 70,000 years ago are going to be similar to the ways that people move now and into the future as they're facing those kinds of crises. And so these approaches, they're all open access as a part of our paper. What we hope is that this can lead to kind of a paradigm shift and lead to understanding the past as a way to have a better and more just present and future. So I want to thank especially all of my co-authors and all of these wonderful people who gave me video footage of Australia and other places. Some of you know Artemy Kolchinsky, and he provided all of the video of White Sands National Monument. I want to thank my collaborators on my many, many projects around the world and my funders. And of course, thank you. And I'd like to open it up for questions.